thank you for being here. You've obviously been such an important part of FCLT since the very beginning. Can you talk a little bit about just generally why long-termism is so important today?
Yeah, well, we have a good group of people here that is working on long-termism, so it's not the prerogative of one person. We really need to do it together. But there's a very simple reason. If we want to live happily on this planet now and for generations to come, we need to address some of these issues of climate change, of food security, of inclusion, and all these issues cannot be solved in the quarterly rat race that we're now under. So for the longer term solutions, you also need to give the companies that are the major providers of these solutions the space to do that. So the best thing a company can do to start with is to be sure that it's run for a purpose other than the shareholders. If a company can't verbalize its purpose for what it's here, then it doesn't have a purpose for being here. And the shareholders should insist on that. And that's a strategy then obviously that permeates several years, as you've seen this morning. Secondly, what you can do as a CEO is to be sure that your board understands that as well and is fully behind that, that you don't get an unnecessary pressure. You need to do the same with your employees and engage your employees. And then I think more of the CEOs need to actively seek the right shareholders. With the tenure of CEOs getting shorter and shorter, there is a tendency to dance to the tunes of the current shareholder base, which might not be the best thing. So we've gone out and actively seek the right shareholders, and then you need to communicate. But at the end of the day, for a purpose-driven business model like we have in Unilever, nothing for us is more important than delivering, because we are showing that this is a model for multiple stakeholders, and we're very worried that if we don't deliver, people are going to question the essence of what makes this world function long term. So there's an enormous pressure that we well understand that we also need to deliver. That's probably the best thing you have right now in the environment that we live in. But increasingly, because of the environmental and social issues going up at a rapid rate, as we're all aware of, it is easier to demonstrate that addressing them or preventing them will reduce costs, will build reputation, reduce risk, and actually an enormous opportunity to grow your company.
You and Unilever are obviously global leaders in these conversations. If you can think about the road that you have been on in your leadership role at Unilever, can you talk about what some of the bumps were along the way that made it more difficult to implement the vision and move towards the long-term vision that you have for the organization?
Yeah.
And then what you did to tackle those?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think you can do a lot of things, that you shouldn't try to find excuses externally. You know, if you are an investor and you don't ask people about their diversity and try to figure out how they implement diversity, you're as guilty to the origins of the Me Too movement than the people that committed the crimes in the first place. If you don't deliberately ask questions about human rights, for example, or how people are being treated in your value chain, then you actually become part of the problem, even though you might think you can delegate it to others. There are many things the CEOs can do from the start. In Unilever, for example, we abolished guidance and quarterly reporting right from the start. We moved our compensation system to the long term. We didn't need anybody to tell us to do that. We linked it very strongly to the long-term share performance, which I believe is the right thing to do.
Was that a hard transition to make?
No, I think the employees actually understood that, because then it gives them actually space to do what they need to do. You know, otherwise they get into their own short-term dysfunctional behavior. It actually reinforces the strategy is being reinforced with the employees. We looked at our own pension fund. Many companies are complaining about the increased short-termism of the market, but they put their own pension fund on the short-term remits. So we've obviously signed up to PRI, put different mandates out there. In our case, a 25 billion pension fund is not the end of the world, but you certainly can make a dent in that. So some of the obstacles are the same obstacles as what we're trying to deal with here. How do you ensure that with a investor community that is increasingly farther removed from the actual engagement of companies, either it's outsourced to ISS or Glass Lewis or it's index funds, and increasingly the minority shareholders who could be very disruptive, some of them call them activists or hedge funds and all that, seem to dominate the debate. So the bigger challenge is the active engagement of the investor community around the right variables. Still too many in the investor community are too far removed, with a few exceptions, or they separate the ESG from the actual investment, which to me is hard to understand. It's like running our company where we say some of them are responsible for the longer-term sustainability and human rights, and others are responsible for squeezing as much money out of a consumer as we can get. It just doesn't work that way. So you have to make that an integral part, and then I think the conversations that we can have with these longer-term shareholders, who ultimately are interested not only in the longer-term returns, but also in a world that the pensioners can live in, are very much aligned with us, and I think we will move it forward in the right direction.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation about the importance of building the shareholder base that you'd like, and earlier today about the loyalty you have in your own shareholder base. Yeah. Can you talk a bit about how you approached that?
Well, when I became CEO, naively, I'd never been CEO, and I made quite some public statements about the intent of the company to run this for the long term, because we had also been in periods where that wasn't quite working for us, and we paid the price for that. So I also made clear that there were certain types of shareholders we probably would not appreciate in our company, and I discovered it's easier to get rid of shareholders than to attract new shareholders. But over time, as your performance comes in, and you start to deliberately target these other shareholders by not reporting on a quarterly basis, our communication also tended to become more longer term. And there is a correlation between longer term communication and attracting longer term shareholders. And then with our enormous travels across the world, we deliberately target these shareholders that have a longer term orientation. You cannot do that overnight, but bit by bit you get that shareholder base that you deserve in that sense.
You mentioned earlier some of the things that you think CEOs should do. I'm sure you're asked all the time for your advice from people who would, equally like to have the kind of global impact that Unilever has had. What advice would you give in those circumstances to someone? Say the Paul Polman, whatever number of years ago when you started as a CEO. Looking back, what advice would you give yourself then, today?
Well, the first thing is what you're trying to do when you have the fortune of being into this job, that you have to tell yourself first and foremost to stay a human being, that you don't become more important than the institution that you represent, which is a very important thing. And that brings it back to having the courage to change compensation and to have some of the conversations you need to have. And the second thing is a equally simple thing, is you can only be successful long term if you put the interest of others ahead of your own. And once you discover that by doing so you actually are better off yourself, you get the inner courage that is needed in this process as well, to sometimes expose yourself, to sometimes take risk, and obviously be attacked by some of the forces around you. The press notoriously short-term, the sell-side community short-term. There's a part of the investor community, especially with low interest rates, that is happily trying to create unnecessary movements. So CEOs are under tremendous pressure, on top of the daily pressures that they have to deal with economies that might not always function the way they want it to be. But if you single-mindedly are driven by a very strong longer-term purpose of serving the communities in which we live and work, you will do well, in my opinion. A business cannot be a bystander in a system that gives them life in the first place. And we do need to, in the absence of governance functioning now the way that we had envisioned it to function, we need to start de-risking the political process and be actively out there to change the environment. And what I like about the Focusing Capital on the Long-Term group is that is a group of asset owners or asset managers or asset creators that is willing to go beyond their comfort zone to change the boundaries, and by doing so provide space for other people to get into the right behavior, if you want to.
Well, thank you.
And
thank you for being part of doing that.
Thanks for the opportunity.
And thank you for being here today. Appreciate all you do for FCLT.
Likewise.